Session of our citizens hearing on disclosure to order.
Gentlemen, if you would rise and repeat after me, I'd appreciate it. I do hereby affirm that I will tell the truth and nothing but the truth to this committee today. Thank you very much.
We'll begin with Captain Roger Solis. Am I pronouncing that right, sir?
Solis is correct. Thank you. Ms. Kilpatrick and panel, I would first like to briefly describe the incident that I experienced in March 1967. At that time, I was a first lieutenant, U.S. Air Force, stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. I was trained and assigned duties as a missile launch officer for the Minuteman I intercontinental ballistic missile. I was designated Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander and part of a two-man crew. My commander at that time was Lieutenant Frederick Mywold. He's now deceased. I will briefly review the diagrams showing the Launch Control Center, the launch facility. We will show you shortly when one of the other speakers present. We were on duty inside the Oscar Launch Control Center, a concrete capsule located about 60 feet underground. We had operational control over 10 Minuteman nuclear missiles. Each missile operates independently and has its own source of primary and backup power systems. It is important for you to note that the command and control for these missiles was entirely located within the capsule. There was absolutely no means to affect any of the missile systems from outside the capsule. On the evening of March 24th, 1967, while my commander was on a scheduled rest break, I received the first of two phone calls from my topside flight security controller, FSC. The first call was to report unidentified lighted objects flying above the facility. They reported they were flying at very high speeds, making very odd maneuvers, nothing an aircraft could do, and they just wanted to report it. I didn't pay much attention to that first call, and I basically hung up on them. Minutes later, the FSC phoned again and reported in a very agitated state that there was a large oval-shaped object hovering above the front gate. It was a red, pulsating, lighted object, approximately 30, 40 feet in diameter. The best he could describe it. It was difficult to distinguish a structural part of it on the inside, except that it was glowing red, pulsating object. He had all the men out there with their weapons drawn. He wanted me to tell him what to do next. I, of course, told him something like, make sure nothing comes inside the perimeter fence. Of course, our primary duty was to secure those nuclear missiles. Immediately after that call, I started to inform my commander about the incident. As I started to inform my commander, our missiles began to shut down. We lost alert status on all 10 missiles while this object was above our facility. When we queried the fault system, all missiles reported guidance and control system failure. We had a way of querying faults within the system called VERSA. It's a voice-activated system, and we were getting channels 9 and 12, which is guidance and control system. At the same time, we had indicator lights showing security violations at two of the launch facilities where the missiles were physically located. While Lieutenant Mywold reported the incident to the wing command post, I phoned upstairs and directed the security alert team to be sent to those launch facilities with security violations to investigate those indications. At that time, the FSC reported to me that the object had flown off at high speed. When the security alert team arrived at the affected LFs, and I'll brief LFs meaning launch facilities, they reported seeing the object hovering over those sites. As they approached closer to the object, they lost all communications with the FSC. After speaking to the wing command post, Lieutenant Mywold informed me that the same thing happened at another flight. At that time, I assumed that meant that night, but it turns out what he meant was it happened at another flight about a week earlier, and that's the Echo flight incident, which I'll talk about shortly. Right now, I'd like you to hear the portion of the conversation I had with Colonel Mywald, who retired as a full colonel, and I had this conversation sometime in 1996. Can we play the first audio, please?
Back and forth to base because they were doing maintenance on, I don't know, the guidance cans or something, and the maintenance crews were staying over, and there was security and maintenance on site on both, on 2 of the 10 sites. And when the first one went down, I talked to the security out there. They had reported this UFO hovering over the site, and I said, "Yeah, right. What are you guys drinking out there?" And we struck strike teams to both of the sites that had been occupied. And both strike teams, I didn't tell them what we had heard via the LF radio, and I told them to go to get within a mile of the site and call back in on the VHF. And they both had reported it too. So we had 2 maintenance crews, 2 security troops on site, and 2 strike teams all reporting it.
Is that right?
Yep.
Do you remember any of the names of any of those guys?
Nope.
You don't?
Sorry, there's a little mix-up there. That was Colonel Walter Fiegel, who was the Deputy Missile Crew Commander at Echo Flight. Can we have the Mywald audio, please?
Any reports from their field about UFOs?
So I remember the 2 guards that had gone out to one of the sites finally got back scared to death. We had to relieve them of duty.
Yeah. Oh, you mean our guards?
Yeah,
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, and roving patrol type.
Oh, I see.
They had gone out to one of the sites, one of the LFs, and on the way back they lost radio contact, and we ended up having to send them back to base earlier. I'm not sure what happened. I don't think they ever returned to guard duty.
And what were they scared about?
Well, they had seen these crazy things. Then
Oh, they did?
yeah,
They reported that to you?
they reported it to the top side guy.
Oh, the topside guy, that's right. Okay. 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 Well, interesting, don't you think?
Yeah.
After we were relieved by another crew the next morning, I arrived back at base.
Mr. Salas?
Yes.
In a couple sentences, would you tell us what we just heard? The conversation.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was a little confusing. The first conversation you heard was Colonel Walter Fiegel, now retired. As far as I know, he's still alive. He's authorized me to use that audio, by the way. It was a recording of a telephone conversation I had with him in 1996. And he described the fact that he had, on 2 of his launch facilities, he had maintenance crews out there and security guards. And when the first missile went down in his flight, they reported that there were UFOs overhead as the missiles went down. He lost all 10 of his missiles in rapid succession. That incident occurred on March 16th, 1967.
He launched them and they went down?
No, the missiles were not launched. He just reported, they reported that the objects were above them, and at that point, the missiles started shutting down. Yeah, disabled. The second audio recording you heard was that of Colonel Mywald, talking about the fact that we had security light violations and we had to send guards out to one or more of the LFs. And they reported seeing the UFOs again. By the way, I've got more audio available that's where Colonel Mywald supports my entire statement about what occurred. So he was consistent on supporting this for up until the time he passed away last year. After we received relieved by another crew the next morning, right back to the base, we reported to the squadron commander's office. There we were ordered to sign non-disclosure statements regarding our specific incident. I did sign a non-disclosure statement. And we were ordered not to talk to anybody about this. It was then designated a highly classified incident. At no time did we lose power during the incident. I want to emphasize, we always had electrical power. The sensitive information network, SIN cables that carried the signals to the missile systems were triply shielded from electromagnetic interference. The preliminary investigation isolated the failure to the logic coupler at each missile. The logic coupler is associated with the missile guidance system. That's about the best I can explain to you what the logic coupler does. I'll refer you to a portion of the unit wing history. I believe you have documents that I supplied you with that talk about the Echo flight incident, and I'll just read part of it. It says, in the opinion of the team, was that externally generated signals caused the generation of these two channels and shut down the launch facilities. The possibility of this is very remote due to the fact that all 10 couplers would have to fail in the flight within a few seconds of each other. This statement confirms that signals were sent to each individual missile separately in order to disable them. From my knowledge of the operating system at the time, neither I nor the investigative team could define the method or means by which these signals were sent to disable the missiles, each in the same manner, meaning each missile failed for the same reason, guidance and control system failure. Mr. Robert Kaminsky was the Boeing team leader for the investigation of the Echo flight shutdown. In a response to our inquiry, he stated, "This kind of event is virtually impossible once the system was up and running. The team met with me to report their findings, and it was decided that the final report would have nothing significant in it to explain what happened at Echo flight."
Just one moment, Captain. We did not explain it, just working with my congressional research assistant on the end of the table. We are going to allow 10 minutes for each of you. I'm not sure, I just got the time sign for the captain, and I don't believe that he's been talking 10 minutes, has he? He has been talking 10 minutes. Captain, can you, and since we didn't let you know ahead of time, I'm going to give you additional 3 minutes, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. I'll
You're
try to
very
get
welcome.
through it as quickly as
That's
I
okay.
can. After meeting with the engineers to discuss the results of their investigation, Mr. Kaminsky was notified by his supervisor that he should not submit his final report because the incident was reported to be a UFO event. Even though the Boeing company was the principal contractor for the Minuteman I missile, the report on the incident was not submitted by specific request of the Air Force. However, the Air Force did perform their own classified investigation where they identified a possible failure mode as stated above. In my opinion, we did not have the technical capability to produce a machine then or now that would be able to instigate the failure mode of these missiles identified in the unit wing history. In addition, the unidentified objects displayed the physical and flight characteristics that no known aircraft type could achieve then or now. Therefore, I have concluded these objects were non-terrestrial in origin. An important related activity ongoing, and this is important, on December 17, 1969, the official U.S. Air Force investigation into the UFO phenomenon was terminated. The principal basis for this, and you have the Air Force position on UFOs, I believe. I've given you a copy of that. The principal basis for this termination was the evaluation of a report prepared by the University of Colorado entitled Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects. In 1966, the U.S. Air Force awarded a $500,000 contract to the University of Colorado for the purpose of studying the UFO phenomenon. I'll refer to this study as the Condon investigation, for its team leader, Edward Condon. In fact, it was never intended to be a scientific study because the Air Force did not propose that any scientific hypothesis regarding the phenomena be evaluated. The Condon team relied on input and evaluations of reported UFO incidents from Air Force officers at various bases. The Condon team was, except for one individual, not authorized to review classified reports of Air Force incidents regarding the phenomenon. They were not even informed that classified UFO files existed until after the termination of their study. I have evidence supporting this. With respect to the 1967 Echo and Oscar flight UFO incidents, there was a deliberate effort to keep information about those incidents from the Condon Committee. In 1967, Dr. Roy Craig, the chief investigator for the Condon Committee, was informed by Mr. Raymond Fowler, a contractor working for Sylvania on Minuteman Electrical Systems, that the Echo flight shutdowns at Maelstrom had occurred during a UFO sighting. In October '67, he visited Maelstrom to inquire about this. Dr. Craig recalls this inquiry with Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chase, the base operations officer at Maelstrom. After Colonel Chase and I had exchanged pleasantries in his office, this is a quotation, I asked him about the Echo incident. The colonel caught his breath and expressed surprise that I knew of it. I can't talk about that, he said. Colonel Chase had assured me that the incident had not involved a UFO. Since Colonel Chase was the last man I would doubt, when he conveyed this information, I accepted the information as factual and turned the review over to Bob Lowe, who had received, Robert Lowe was the deputy condon, and he was the only one cleared to look at classified information. When Dr. Robert Lowe, the deputy condon, requested the Air Force allow him to review the secret report of the Echo incident, he was informed that the report would be too highly classified to allow that review. Dr. Craig did not interview any of the many witnesses that were named to him by Ray Fowler that he could have interviewed. He did not interview either of the crews, Echo or Oscar crew. In addition, the Air Force Office of Project Blue Book was deliberately misinformed about these incidents. In a letter from Colonel James Minot, and I think you have these letters in front of you, he was right pat, Blue Book essentially. He requested of Colonel Chase in June of '67, inquired of reports they had received that there were equipment malfunctions and abnormalities during the UFO sightings. The written reply from Colonel Chase stated, this office has no knowledge of equipment malfunctions and abnormalities in equipment during the period of UFO sightings. This evidence and the Air Force...
Captain, I think you just have a short piece to go, is that right? Just one page left?
Just very short.
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
I'm almost done.
Please proceed.
And by the way, this is a very complex case.
Absolutely, we can tell that. Yes, sir. Thank you, and we appreciate your testimony.
This is evidence that the Air Force purposefully denied the Condon investigators the knowledge that the Echo and Oscar flight shutdowns were UFO-related incidents. Since the Air Force cites this particular study as the primary reason for the official rejection of the UFO phenomenon, and claims that no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force was ever an indication of threat to our national security. And in light of my own experience and others, I must conclude the U.S. Air Force was and is engaged in lying and disinforming the public about the realities of the UFO phenomenon. That's the end of my statement.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very briefly, I just want to point out the fact that the next two witnesses that you will hear from, Mr. Schindelli and Mr. Scott, this is the very first time they are going public, and I want to honor these guys for having the courage to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Captain. Mr. Shillelagh.
My name is David D. Shinley,
Shindley.
Captain, U.S. Air Force, retired. In 1966, I was involved in an incident while stationed at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. I was told to never speak of the incident again, and also told that as far as I was concerned, it never happened. Because of that, I am before you today with a bit of trepidation. I must say a lot of trepidation, as I have never before shown my face in person on this matter. I was a Minuteman ICBM launch control officer, a first lieutenant, and a deputy missile combat crew commander in a two-man launch crew with my crew commander who held the rank of captain. He was about 15 years older than I. I held a top secret clearance, which was required for my job. It all began one morning when I was watching TV while having breakfast, and I heard the local news announcer mention that some residents in the town of Mulhall, North Dakota, had seen strange lights overnight, which they attributed to a UFO. This caught my attention because I was scheduled for duty that morning at a launch control facility called November Flight, about 3 miles west of Mulhall and about 37 miles north of Minot, North Dakota. I lived in the town of Minot at the time, and I drove to the air base to attend the morning pre-departure crew briefing at wing headquarters, where all 15 missile crews would normally meet each day prior to pulling alert duty at their respective launch control facilities. During that pre-departure crew briefing, it was mentioned that some missiles at November Flight had gone off alert, but there was no further information provided. I immediately connected this to the news item that I heard earlier in the morning regarding a possible UFO sighting near the town of Mulhall. When the briefing was over, several of the launch crews seated near me commented about the news item, which they had also heard that morning. And there was speculation about a possible connection with November Flight. My crew commander had also heard the news item. And we were both anxious and quite curious about what we might find as we drove out to the launch control facility. If you could display my second slide. On this second slide, I don't believe you members have a picture of this, but you can see it on the screen here. This is the November Launch Control Facility from an air view from Google Earth. If you could show that again. There is an access road to the flight to the facility from the north, coming down to the flight facility, where there's a main gate at the perimeter fence. The perimeter fence goes around the launch control facility building, top side, and there's a garage to the right of the main gate. The usual procedure upon arrival was to inspect the grounds and building, but this time my commander immediately went into the security section of the building to debrief security personnel and guards. The security center was the topmost north side of the building, near the main gate. I entered the facility from the back door at the end of the facility, and then encountered the site manager, a tech sergeant, who immediately took me into the day room and asked if I had been briefed on the previous night's events. I said I hadn't. We then proceeded toward the windows on the west side of the day room, where he described to me the large object with flashing lights that had been hovering just outside the fence that night. And he spread his arms out in front of him to indicate its size, the size of the object. Based on his description, I estimated the object may have been 80 to 100 feet wide, and approximately 100 feet from the building, maybe a bit closer. I immediately asked if it had been a helicopter, and he said that it just hovered with no noise being heard, quite unlike the usual noisy helicopters heard from within the building. I also asked what the flashing lights were like, but he could not answer. They were unlike any he had ever seen. They were not like the usual beacon lights on planes, but something like a pulsating glow. He then said the object, while hovering close to the ground, then glided to the right toward the north end of the building and out of sight. The object then came into view from the security section of the facility and hovered just behind and slightly to the right of the main gate, concealed partly by the large garage located within the fenced area to the right of the gate. As you can see there, the garage is labeled the second position of the object. This location put the object almost directly above the hardened launch control capsule, located 60 feet below ground. All our missiles, our 10 missiles, were located 4 to 14 miles away from the launch control facility. This capsule was located approximately underneath the garage. This was the launch crew quarters and the launch control center for all 10 interconnected nuclear-tipped missiles that were located away from the launch facility. Security personnel confirmed everything that the site manager had related to me. My commander and I then proceeded to take the elevator down to the launch control center, the capsule, to relieve the two-man officer crew below. After entering the capsule, our eyes were immediately transfixed on the launch control console, which showed that all missiles were off alert and unlaunchable. We had never seen such a thing before. The outgoing crew briefed us on the wild events that transpired overnight and indicated that the missiles malfunctioned at the time the object was hovering directly above the capsule and next to the main gate. We speculated on the possibility of an EMF pulse that might have created the situation. We had no doubt, however, that the 10 outlying nuclear-tipped missiles of November flight had been compromised, tampered with, and put out of commission by the object that had paid a visit. Normally, it was quite unusual to have even one missile down, except for maintenance. And Wing Headquarters was very proud of having more than 95% uptime for all 150 missiles of the wing. The following morning, after we had been relieved by the follow-on crew, we arrived topside, and I attempted to further query the flight security controller who had been on duty at the time of the situation. But he interrupted me, and he said that he had been instructed not to discuss the incident. That is when my commander then told me that he had received a call while I was on a scheduled rest break down below, and he was told that we were never to discuss the incident. When I asked where the directive came from, he said the OSI. He evidently received a call from the OSI. With no discussion allowed on the subject between him or me together or with anybody else, my crew commander and I were left in limbo and left on our own to conjure in our own minds how other situations might unfold and be handled. Normally, the Air Force would train us on all procedures. We were in a simulator constantly training. This serious lack of follow-through by the Air Force was more than bewildering, and it served to keep this situation on our minds. Together, there were a dozen of us involved with this incident. My commander and I were not there during the encounter, but we had to deal with the ramifications of the incident, and I'll never forget the frightened emotion on the faces of topside airmen who were gathered with me when I was briefed by the site manager. Besides those of us at the launch control facility, there had to be many more people involved with this, including maintenance people who had to retarget and reline the missiles, also additional security personnel to guard and protect the missile launch facilities, and who knows how many others on base were concerned. Everyone had been silenced. The incident was never discussed, and I never heard a word of any other incident from people that I associated with. I never spoke a word about my incident for almost 40 years, and my wife never knew. After several years of searching the internet in hopes of finding someone who would give me a clue about my incident.
Excuse me, Mr. Shames.
Yes.
I yield you additional 2 minutes, excuse me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I then found what was described by Captain Robert Salas, and I felt immediate, joyous freedom from my haunting memory. I then informed my wife. Since then, I have run across several missileers from my days at Minot who were there with me in the wing, and 2 of them have gone public with their own experiences. Two others have described to me their unique experiences, but they have pleaded that I not divulge their names. They fear losing their Air Force pension, are losing their personal integrity and keeping a secret, or being ridiculed. I also know of two other officers involved in incidents, but they will not admit to their secret, probably for the same reasons. And then there's the late Captain Val Smith of my squadron, who is mentioned in official documents released by FIA. He was interviewed by the late Dr. Alan Hynek of Blue Book fame, who wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post, published on 17 December 1966, which described the incident that Smith was involved with on 25th August 1966. Hynek stated in the article, "This incident was not picked up by the press. It's typical of the puzzling cases that I have studied during the 18 years that I've served as the Air Force's scientific consultant on the problem of UFOs." Display the third slide, please. Just prior to release of this Post article, the Minot Daily News got wind of it and then published on 6 December 1966 a front page news item with major bold headline that read, "Minot Launch Control Center saucer cited as one indication of outer space visitors." The front page. I remember this article. I thought, oh, maybe I could start talking. In 1966, when I was at Minot, the evidence was everywhere that something quite unique was happening. But I was embedded in a shell of silence. The Air Force knew the truth. The Air Force knew that I knew the truth. And that is the only reason they warned and instructed me that it never happened. Thank you.
And thank you, sir, for your courage today and for your service. Sergeant Scott.
Okay. I'm Tech Sergeant David Charles Scott, United States Air Force Security Police, retired. At the time of my sighting, I was an Airman First Class with a secret security clearance and was assigned to Alpha Flight, 91st Missile Security Squadron, Strategic Air Command, Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. November 1974. It was after midnight when Airman Bill Gray, a member of my security alert team, and I were dispatched from Alpha 1 Launch Control Facility to an alarm situation at one of our 10 Minuteman nuclear missile sites. Probably just another jackrabbit setting off an outer zone alarm, we thought. As we drove there, Gray spotted a strange light in the night sky, called it to my attention. It appeared to be about the size of a stars in the sky, but was pulsating red. We checked the site and found everything secure. Gray said the strange light had gotten bigger and acted weird when I was below. Then we parked our vehicle off-site to await the alarm system to reset and the order which would allow us to leave the area. Now the strange light in the sky was pulsating and changing color in a sequence red, blue, and yellow. Suddenly our radio went dead and the idling engine of our vehicle quit. Gray and I sat there on guard duty for 45 minutes, protecting our missile site. We wondered aloud if the strange light above was a UFO. When the light changed to white and pulsated 3 times, and in quick succession, it disappeared and our engine came to life as the radio also came back on. As it did, Sergeant Hicks, our flight security controller, called and ordered us back to Alpha 1. All alarms had reset properly back at the missile site. We arrived back at Alpha 1 a little after 3 in the morning. We reported our story to Sergeant Hicks about the strange light. We wanted to convince him that we had not fallen asleep on duty or we weren't drunk. He said, "I believe you men." Then Sergeant Hicks hit us with a bombshell. All Minuteman nuclear missile site alarms in our wing had sounded simultaneously. Many security police and security alert teams reported seeing the strange lights, which Gray and I saw, and they too lost radio communication and vehicle power. "You know what I think?" Gray asked. "I think it was a UFO." Sergeant Hicks just nodded. I ventured, "Should we report it? Gray and I aren't lying. We'll write statements." Gray signaled his agreement with a nod. Sergeant Hicks said, "Why stir up a lot of trouble? The official Air Force position is that UFOs don't even exist. Let's just drop it unless you two want to get laughed out of this service." A few nights later, in the security police barracks back at Minot Air Force Base, I was listening to a news broadcast from Winnipeg, Canada radio station. The announcer read the story of an incident which had occurred just a few nights before, and fighter planes of the Canadian Air Force had scrambled to pursue the UFO. The fighters tracked it until it climbed at a steep angle and with blazing speed disappeared. The Canadians responded to the UFO that was over our missile site. When that strange light disappeared, the Canadians picked up on it because the reporter on the radio then stated the United States Air Force would release the report on this incident, and it would be released in May of 1975. But the day came and went without official comment. And as far as I know, the U.S. Air Force has never officially recognized that event.
Complete, sir? You yield? Are you complete? Thank you very much, Sergeant Scott. Thank you. Very riveting, and thank you for your service as well. Now, Captain, I won't even try to pronounce your name. Please say it for us.
Fenstermacher.
You heard that? Can you just present?
Fenstermacher.
Fenstermacher. You're on, Captain. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you. If we have time, I have some pictures and graphics of the LCFs and the LFs and the LCCs if we have time for it. It's not really pertinent, but I thought you might like a little tour of the facilities.
You have them as a slide for paper or on our screen?
On the screen.
Okay, thank you.
I was a captain in the Air Force and a Minuteman III Combat Crew Commander from 1974 to 1977. I was stationed at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming and assigned to the 400th Strategic Missile Squadron. Quite honestly, I was and still remain a skeptic, and at the time did not believe in this UFO phenomena. In the fall of '76, my deputy and I were on duty at Romeo Launch Facility, or LCF. The LCF was the part of Romeo that was above the ground, as we saw with David Schindley. And the launch control capsule was the one that we took an elevator down to. It was located 60 feet below the ground and behind an 8-ton door, so we were pretty secure in there. In order to stay awake, my deputy and I were monitoring the VHF radio communication between our security alert team, which we friendly called the cops. David was one of them, David Scott, and between our flight security controller, FSC, our topside NCO. The SAT team was out doing their regularly routine checks. I think they were responding to one of those jackrabbits out one of our launch facilities. And so they were out and away. At approximately 2 a.m., the FSC called the SAT and said, "Hey, pull over. Get out of the vehicle and look around." That's all he said. Gave no direction or any guidance. A few seconds, and he also said, "See what you see." A few seconds later, they reported they saw nothing, and they said, "Oops, wait a minute, we do see something in the distance." The FSC, "Well, what do you see?" And they said in an excited voice, it was a light in the sky, it was a bright white pulsating light, and they could see some other colors in between the pulsations. The FSC asked them where the light was located, and the reply was that it was some distance to the north. And then after a pause, they said, geez, it really looks like it's near the LCF or near where you are. The FSC then asked the SAT to return back to the launch control facility. My deputy and I kind of looked at each other and did a double take because what the heck was that all about? So we called the FSC on our hotline and asked them what was going on. He very calmly said that right now, right above the LCF, there was a silent object with a very white pulsating light. Between the pulsations, he could see a red and blue. I asked for specifics, and his best guess, well, he said it was a fat cigar. It looked like a fat cigar. And his best guess was that it was 80 to 100 feet above the ground and 40 to 50 feet long. It was hard to see his perspective exactly because he didn't know how close. If it was way high, it could have been 1,000 feet long. If it was way low, it could have been less. But that was his best guess. While we were talking, he reported that it was moving down the access road to the east, and very slowly and very quietly. I asked him to keep us updated. My deputy and I talked about what we should do with this information. In a few minutes, the FSC called back and said the object had stopped a few miles to the east and appeared to be above the closest launch facility, or LF. So we ordered the SAT team, who was now on their way back to the launch control facility, to go to that LF that had the object above it, and they said they had to return to the launch control facility for batteries and for their flashlights. 10 minutes or so later, we asked the status of the SAT team, and we were told that they made it back to the LCF, but had departed yet. They were just about ready to go. The object moved further east along the access road above another LF. We again ordered the SAT team to that location, and they reported they had to first gas up their truck. It seemed to take them a long time before they appeared to be on their way. Shortly after the object went to the first launch facility, we reported the incident to our SAC command post at FE Warren, and the NCO that took the call laughed at us and said, call us back when that thing eats the SAT team, and hung up. As well as logging everything in the official log, my deputy and I, who each had prior service, meaning we were enlisted before we were an officer, we started taking personal notes. In addition to the official notes, we wanted to document everything that transpired. At our next hourly 400th SMS crew checks for the flights Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Sierra, and Tango, we told the other crew members what our object had done and received laughter and an attitude of general disbelief. What are you guys, crazy? Right after the group communication, the crew from Quebec called. They were the team we had dropped off on the way to Romeo and said that earlier that morning they had a similar object above a couple of their launch facilities. We asked what direction they were heading, and they said that they appeared to be heading towards me at Romeo. We asked what happened when they reported it, and they said, are you crazy? We didn't report it, we would have been laughed at. Well, he was right about that. They also mentioned that the SAT team that they had sent to one of the LFs had had an accident leaving the LF, and the Quebec crew seemed to find humor in that SAT accident. And that's important for what happens a few years later. We contacted the FE Warren SAC command post again, and several times, and reported, have you logged this yet? They said no. I pushed it forward, got an officer in charge, and stated that if they didn't log this, if they didn't take this seriously, I was going to call the base commander. It was now 3 o'clock in the morning, and the base commander would have not liked getting awoken at 3 o'clock, but I would have. Then we got a call back from a senior NCO at the command post asking for more details, so they appeared to be logging it. The object moved to another LF, and the SAT team never made it to that one either. Our FSC kept us appraised of each movement and reported that at 4 a.m. approximately, it moved away very rapidly to a star-sized object and then disappeared. At no time did our missiles go offline, though. At no times did our missiles go offline. And I now understand why. Only recent information came out for that. Meanwhile, back in 1976, the next morning, we were relieved by another crew for our normal return to F.E. Warren, and when we went topside, we found the FSC curled up in a chair in kind of a fetal position. He had been relieved by the day FSC, but was not able to sleep and obviously was very distressed. The SAT members were conveniently not at the LCF. My deputy and I were both prior service and had a good rapport with our FSC, and we asked him about the difficulty the SAT team had about going to the LFs. After making us promise that we would not report the SAT, he told us that in fact they never left the launch control facility, and they said they were not going to any LF that had that thing above it. So we picked up our crew member from Quebec and we returned trip to F.E. Warren and discussed the excitement of that early morning hours. They insisted they would not report the incident and that if we reported it, they would deny that it happened. If we reported their involvement in it, they would deny that it happened. Upon our return to our squadron, we reported the incident with our flight commander. And the next morning, we were called in by the commander of the 400th SMS. He asked us about the incident, and when he discovered we had personal notes, he asked to see them. Once in his hands, he tore them up and said we were never to talk about this again and required us to sign documents that I'm a little fuzzy about what they really said. We reluctantly signed them after going into a broom closet to talk about it for 10 minutes. At our next couple of departure meetings, an officer that we'd never seen before told us that this incident was classified and that officially never happened. And I always wanted to question which was it. Was it classified or it didn't happen? After a press conference in September 2010, I was given a name of a former Quebec SAT team that wanted to talk to me. I contacted and heard a story, and I'm confident he was one of the SAT members on duty that night at our incident Romeo. This is what he told me. As they approached the Quebec 9 in their vehicle, they saw a bright pulsating light with a beam of light extending down to the launch facility. While attempting to accomplishing one of their many checklists, SAC is known for their checklist, he actually reached into the beam. That spooked both of the SAT members, and they jumped in their truck, and as they raced away, they had an accident and the truck was damaged. That tied into me that in fact was the Quebec team that was on duty the night when my Quebec commanders told me that their SAT team had an accident. So I was confident they were them. I asked, when they got back to F.E. Warren, they were ridiculed by the fellow SAT members. Someone even drew a drawing of them seeing a UFO, hitting a cow, drinking booze, and they were ridiculed for their time. And this guy was really, to this day, upset about that ridicule. I asked him to share his story with others and make a formal statement. He said, no, this is it. He was done, and he would not talk to anybody about this again, including me. And he, in fact, has not responded to any calls or emails from me. I kept silence about this 1976 incident. After all, a good officer follows his or her orders. I caught Larry King live on a Friday night on July 18th of 2008, and I came in at a segment, and I saw a former Air Force officer talking about a similar situation. I did not get the beginning of the segment, as I think I said. This guy's name was Bob Salas, and I thought he was one of the crew members from Quebec. He was describing my incident, And then I found out, in fact, his happened in 1967 at Minot Air Force Base, not F.E. Warren. A skeptic on that show did not believe Mr. Salas' story and seemed to doubt his credibility, his honesty, and his sanity. After much thought, much later, I contacted one of the guests on the show, Robert Hastings, and over time, it took me like 4 months to get up the information, and I slowly came out, first anonymously, came forward, first anonymously, first with my first name, then I said, what the heck? If they come after me, they come after me. Because I had the same trepidation that you did. Would I lose my pension? Would I disappear, et cetera? So here I am. This is what led to this.
Thank you, Captain.
Thank you.
I served on the Armed Services Committee as well as the Air Force Academy Board for 6 years of my 14 years in the Congress. I know the pressure that you're under. I know when you sign those things, they're like for life. So I appreciate all your courage and your service, and we all do as a body in the House of Representatives and the Senate as well. So some things they just don't know, but we're going to take it to them. Okay? Come on, Mr. Dolan.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee. I am not a former member of the United States military, but I have devoted my life to researching the matter of UFOs and national security. What we know from research and archival work is that from the beginning of the atomic age, there have been good reports, very good reports, of unknown objects with extraordinary capabilities being in the vicinity of our most advanced nuclear facilities. They certainly appear to be interested, if not always tampering, definitely interested. We're fortunate in having obtained a few items of interest through the Freedom of Information Act. It's obvious that much remains beyond our reach, but what we have is definitely of interest. I'm going to describe a few of these cases to you, but first I want to describe an event that is not in a declassified document. It's a written account from a credible witness that really is quite fascinating. This is from a U.S. Navy officer named Byron D. Varner, who wrote a privately published book. It's called Living on the Edge, an American War Hero's Daring Feats as a Navy Fighter Pilot, Civilian Test Pilot, and CIA Mercenary. There's an interesting title for you. The book includes a UFO encounter by another Navy pilot, a man named Roland Powell. And both of these gentlemen were interviewed at length by the then head of the Mutual UFO Network, Mr. Walter Andrus. Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, is the largest civilian UFO organization in the U.S., has been for years. So here's what happened. In July 1945, near the close of the Pacific War, the Hanford Atomic Facility, located in the state of Washington, one of the key elements of America's new nuclear infrastructure, was there. Now, although by this time no one was expecting a Japanese threat to it, as the end of the war was near, but there were still standby aircraft armed and ready at all times, just in case anything were to happen. At noon, on a date they don't know exactly, but it was July 1945, an alert was sounded. Radar had detected a fast-moving object that was now in a holding pattern directly above the Hanford plant. It was very high. No one was able to see it at first, only on radar. 6 pilots flying Grumman F-6F Hellcats were sent up. Finally, they saw it, and they flew to intercept it. It was estimated to be about 65,000 feet, very, very high up. No one was able to recognize it. It had what the book described as, quote, a saucer-like appearance, bright, very fast, very high. The pilot, Roland Powell, later described this object to be as large as, quote, 3 aircraft carriers side by side, oval-shaped, very streamlined, like a stretched-out egg, and pinkish in color. He said it gave out a kind of vapor around the outside edges, he believed from portholes or vents, and he speculated that the vapor was being discharged to form a cloud as a disguise. Anyway, the pilots were baffled. They were told to go higher. They replied, if we go much higher, we're going to ruin these engines. And the answer came back, blow the engines if you have to, but use full power, full military power, full throttle injection, maximum continuous, go for it. They were then told that if the engines quit, they were to glide back toward the airport and hope that you make it. Even so, no one was able to get close enough to the object. It didn't seem to do anything. It just hovered there as if observing, staying well enough out of reach. The pilots were quite amazed at its ability to hover. Finally, some engines, according to Roland Powell, did begin to fail. Fuel consumption got critical, and the planes returned to base. After this, the craft just disappeared as quickly as it came. It did not return. They had pushed their aircraft up to 42,000 feet, which was 5,000 feet above their maximum ceiling. It was very obviously a serious event. No press coverage, as you would expect. Now, you might argue, you might quibble that this is just a story unconfirmed by government or military documents, but it was a detailed story from an experienced World War II pilot, and you can take it for what you will. We do, however, have a number of declassified government documents that describe UFOs being seen over America's nuclear facilities in the early atomic era. Several from the FBI describe a series of events over and near Los Alamos. This is, again, another central component of America's nuclear program. One of these FBI documents from January 31, 1949, and then there was another from a year and a half later in August of 1950, describe what you can only call an invasion of sensitive airspace repeatedly by unknown and extraordinary objects. So the first document gives specific dates for the initial sightings when they began in December 1948. In that month, they occurred on the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 11th, 13th, 14th, 20th, and 28th of that month. And the witnesses were all very high caliber. We're talking special agents of OSI, airline pilots, military pilots, Los Alamos security inspectors. There was some speculation that these objects might have been Soviet, but there were no reasons offered, no evidence offered, and in fact, there's no evidence to this day. Meteorites were also ruled out in this analysis. The initial conclusion was that they were either dealing with a previous unknown natural phenomenon or something man-made, except no one seemed to know any project anywhere that could have caused these sightings. And again, after more than 60 years, we still don't. By the way, the second of those documents, referring to Los Alamos incursions, this is by August of 1950, stated that by then a total of 150 observations had been made. You think about it, 150 over that region in about a year and a half. By then, they'd been able to determine that there are three types of objects being seen. First was a type known as green fireballs, which were objects, this is in the words of the memo, moving at high speeds in shapes resembling half-moons, circles, and disks emitting green light. The second type was a bit more of the in-your-face variety, that is disks, round flat-shaped objects or phenomena moving at fast velocity and emitting a brilliant white light or reflected light. That's the memo. And then the third type were meteors, at which you might breathe a sigh of relief, except that the author then immediately says, well, aerial phenomena resembling meteoric material, moving at high velocity and varying in color. The colors noted were white, amber, red, and green, so quite a range. We don't know what these objects were to this day. Another key place where the U.S. developed its atomic technologies was at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Here's where the Manhattan Project had established a pilot plant to produce plutonium. UFOs were reported there as well. A declassified teletype from October 13, 1950, stated that the night before, an Air Force radar installation picked up 11 unknown objects, perhaps more, traveling across Oak Ridge. They were slow, low in the sky, less than 5,000 feet, maybe 1,000. Fighters were scrambled, but they saw nothing. They didn't have any explanation for this. The radar was in perfect operating condition. Everyone knew their job. That was only the beginning at Oak Ridge. An FBI teletype of December 5th, 1950, writes of 6 unidentified objects over Oak Ridge from the previous day. It's clear that people were scratching their heads. Some wondered if this was maybe a weather phenomenon. It doesn't appear to be because the sightings continued. And we get another teletype from just a few days later, December 8th, from the FBI's Richmond office. Here's a quote. This office very confidentially advised by Army Intelligence Richmond that they have been put on immediate high alert for any data whatsoever concerning flying saucers. Violations of airspace there occurred on the 15th and 16th of December 1950, and quite a few over the next few months. And recall that this is during the Korean War. If a major crisis occurring on the other side of the world, monopolizing the news and the efforts of the United States military, and yet you got a statement like this, that they want any information on flying saucers. You have to ask why. Odd craft were seen for quite some time over Oak Ridge. A fascinating document from late 1953 describes a visual sighting of a UFO seen over Oak Ridge. This is an incredible case. An F-86 fighter aircraft had just flown by, after which a black object was seen to appear out of a white cloud. It's about 12,000 to 15,000 feet altitude. It began to travel in large circles very rapidly for about 5 minutes. Sometimes it looked cigar-shaped, sometimes round. Now here, this is the report. Quote, object was extremely black in color, having an appearance of a deep black metal exterior with a fine gloss. It's quite detailed. It did not leave a vapor trail. No sound was heard. The object flew east at a tremendous speed for what appeared to be 3 miles, where it stopped. The object was then joined by 2 more of these same objects. A formation similar to a spread V was formed, and the objects at a tremendous speed flew in an eastward direction. Words fail me at this point. It's rather extraordinary. Incidentally, there's one more document describing a UFO over the Hanford nuclear plant, which I mentioned earlier. Well, we have an Air Force memo from August 8, 1950, which shows us that the Hanford facility continued to be of great interest. Let me just read this brief statement. Since 30 July 1950, objects round in form have been sighted over the Hanford AEC plant. That's Atomic Energy Commission plant. Air Force jets attempted interception with negative results. All units, including the anti-aircraft battalion, radar units, Air Force fighter squadrons, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have been alerted for further observation. The Atomic Energy Commission states that the investigation is continuing. And by the way, there are no subsequent FOIA documents that we've gotten over what the nature of that investigation was, even though we assume it happened. So all I can say is good grief. Do you think they were taking this seriously, rather? Yes, I think they were. These are more, there are many more of these, and I'll be talking about some of those in the next panel. I think that these are more than mere accident or coincidence. Anyone charged with security over these vital installations would have to take these events very seriously. Indeed, not to do so would be a grave violation of one's sworn duty to protect and defend such installations, and it would not be hard to see why deep secrecy would dominate the subject of UFOs. There are many other incidents regarding UFOs and nuclear installations that occurred in later years. As I mentioned, I'll discuss some of them shortly in the next panel. There's even evidence that these types of events have continued to occur much more recently, although they're a little harder to confirm due to the unresponsiveness and stonewalling of affected agencies. Yet the events which took place so long ago not only demand a scientific analysis, but they also cry out to be understood for what they were, a key component in the implementation of secrecy so profound, so serious, that they contributed to the creation of a state within a state, not bound by the traditional American goals of public openness and responsiveness to the people. And one might argue such events are so serious that the public really doesn't have a need to know. Well, I beg to differ. I do think that citizens in a free republic, if they are to govern, which is the basic idea, do have a need to know about the important things in their world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Excellent, excellent information. We're now going to open it to our members, and we're going to start with Congressman Bartlett.
As I've sat and listened to this testimony, I was asking myself a question. If, for my good, there is a cover-up of these sightings, then what else might the government do for my good? You know, this is kind of Orwellian, 1984. Mr. Dolan, what was the reference for size? Because the description of one of these is different than the description of others. It was enormous in size. What was their reference? You know, when I drive down the road and I have a little speck on my windshield, it doesn't look very big, but by golly, it can obscure my vision of a whole darn car down the road. So perception here, you know, there has to be some reference point before you really know how big something is.
Well, I certainly agree, sir. References for size are notoriously inaccurate. You get this frequently. I assume you're referring to the first incident I mentioned, the Hanford case of 1945, where the pilot said...
Well, he said it was as big as a couple aircraft carriers.
Yeah. I don't know how he came to that conclusion, to be perfectly honest with you. You do have in the research a few confirmed, and by confirmed I simply mean radar plus visual accounts of very enormous objects. It has happened. It seems incomprehensible. In this particular case, I really don't know. He simply, to his perception at that time, it looked very enormous.
The sightings that were talked about are all fairly old. What's happened more recently?
Well, I don't want to jump if you had to say something, Robert.
Recently, let's say 2010, there was a shutdown of 50 missiles at Francis E. Warren Air Force Base. This was announced by the Air Force. It was announced that there was eventually announced there was a computer glitch. Now, I'm very worried about that. I'm not sure I believe that, but we do have witnesses that have come forward, both civilian and Air Force, that said they saw an object in the sky at the time of these shutdowns. This is still being investigated, but these incidents are still going on.
They used to be reported by the press. I don't see reports now in the public media. Do they just not report them because of the climate, the psychological climate that we're in? Or are there no sightings recently? I've seen no reports recently.
I'd just like to mention a couple of things with regard to that. It was mentioned previously, there were, in the Bentwaters panel, they talked about personnel reliability reporting, where they keep tabs on people involved with nuclear weapons and make sure they stay reliable. So this is one way the Air Force is applying pressure not to report these things, but we certainly know, and from reports we're getting from time to time, that these incidents are continuing. But that's one of the reasons I think Mr. Fenstermacher noted that some of their people were very reluctant to report what they saw, and I'm sure that had to do with the PRP program.
2 points. Since all of you have followed this activity, you know, we're not the only country that has Minuteman missiles in holes in the ground pointed at somebody. It's the somebody that we're pointing at. Did they have any, as a result of the implosion of the Soviet Union, the data that came forward in a lot of their files, do you have any knowledge as whether or not the Russians or the Soviets had a similar experience with their missiles? Anyone that wants to answer that? We'll start with Captain
I'll start with one that I think is in my book that I've given you a copy of. This was an incident, I think it was 1982. It was in the Soviet Union. And it was, you know, the witnesses come forward and are named, and actually I think there was an ABC special on this particular incident, but as I recall, UFO came over and actually started their missile on the launch sequence. And thankfully it was shut down from that launch sequence. But there definitely have been sightings over Soviet bases. There's a large quantity there also of incidents where UFOs were seen over missile bases.
Did they have the same effect, that is, stopping the ability of the missile to work through whatever device? I'm
not familiar with any specific case like that.
Okay. Captain Fenstermacher, did you nodded your head like you had some knowledge in that?
So the same report that Bob Salas had, I saw it on ABC, and I've read other reports, but nothing quantifiable. You know, plus if I read reports about some of the people coming forward like we have, I wouldn't necessarily believe them, you know. But I've read reports about it, and instead of knocking them offline, actually it started the launch process, which really, to me, is more worrisome.
Yeah, because they suspected us, but so either the launch sequence was interrupted, or they backed down.
It was initiated.
It was initiated.
Yeah.
But apparently it's the control mechanisms that you could still start the launch sequence, but the control mechanisms were the ones that were interrupted by whatever forces were in effect. So I was just curious that, if there was a focus of attention on U.S. ICBMs, obviously extraterrestrial would have an interest in the Soviet ICBMs, and also would have interest in ICBMs in the world today, not by other countries.
At the very end of the Soviet...
Richard, I was going to just come to you.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Maybe your research, you found something. This was anecdotal. Now, what did you find?
Well, in the last couple of years of the Soviet Union's existence, there was a remarkable amount of openness in the press from the Soviet military on this matter, quite a bit. It was like a window of opportunity, as people used to say at the time, and there were a number of cases. One at Kasputin Yar in 1989. I don't think that involved nuclear, but that was a rocket launch facility. There was an unknown object that appeared. It involved a jet scramble. It was quite extraordinary, very dramatic. There was a case just outside Moscow in March of 1990, which involved an unbelievable encounter by an object that was playing all sorts of games with the Soviet jet interceptor, seen by multiple witnesses. The Soviet Minister of Defense spoke about it. The Soviet top general for air defense spoke about it. They both discounted that this was American. They said there's not a chance. In fact, the top Soviet commander said, there is no way we're ever going to try to attack this. It was vastly beyond anything that we or anyone we know had. So there were quite a few very dramatic cases, and there were some that involved nuclear facilities, but we don't have as much information. It's just not
Good.
much.
Thank you. My time's up.
Thank you. Congresswoman Hooley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have some questions just in general, and maybe we'll start with Captain Solis. These were all classified, and you took the oath that you wouldn't tell. Keep them a secret. Why are you talking now?
Thank you for asking that question. I did not speak about this for almost 30 years. I kept my oath. In 1994, I happened to pick up a book called Above Top Secret by Timothy Good. On page 301 of that book, it stated in a very short paragraph that missiles were shut down at Malmstrom Air Force Base during UFO sighting in 1967. I immediately thought that that was my incident because it described it fairly well, and I decided to go ahead and request, under the Freedom of Information Act, information about that specific incident. They were talking about the Echo flight shutdown. Because I thought that was my incident. So I didn't mention anything about UFOs when we sent the inquiry. I just asked for, actually my researcher, James Klotz, who was with MUFON at the time, requested this information under FOIA. The Air Force wrote back and said, this incident is classified, however, because of the time lapse,
Right.
we're going to declassify it. And so they did. They declassified the Echo shutdown incident, and they started sending me documents. So I started speaking about it at that point because I thought at that point that that's where I was, because you have to understand all these facilities look pretty much the same. I knew I wasn't in the same squadron as Echo, but I did know that at times we did help out when they were short on crews. It wasn't until 1996 when I contacted my commander, Fred Mywald, that I realized that was an Oscar flight. And then I realized I'd been speaking out of turn, so to speak, because I had violated my oath by not speaking about my specific incident. I made a decision to continue speaking about it, and I've been speaking about it ever since. I've never been harried by the Air Force. Nobody's ever knocked on my door and said, can't talk about it. So I continue to speak about it.
Well, we're glad you do. For any one of you, I think so often when we hear the initials UFO, we always think of it as somewhere outer space, don't know, this is a huge universe, where they come from. How, do you think they're UFO? Do you think they're from somewhere in outer space, or do you think these are made by some country that we, in our little universe that we know about? Tell me what you think.
Madam, these are questions that not only private researchers have been asking, but also classified researchers have been asking. When you go back through the history that we know of, back in the late 1940s, when this first appeared on the scene, within the Air Force, there were competing solutions to this problem. Right off the bat, you had analysts who were convinced that there was no possible way that this could have been Soviet manufactured or American, that the performance capabilities were too advanced. There were other people who did suspect the Soviet Union. In fact, during the incident over Los Alamos that I mentioned earlier, there was speculation that, wondering, could this have been a Soviet type of technology? There's just no evidence for that. We all realize that within the black budget world, there are vastly advanced types of technologies in various ways. And in many cases, NSA computing, for example, is at least 3 decades ahead of the rest of the world. At least they were in the 1960s, and they probably still are. And there are other black budget groups that have, who knows what they have. Do they have, So that's always the thing. If you were to see a perfectly hovering triangle, and there are triangular UFOs hovering above you today, you'd have to ask yourself, is this ours or theirs? This is one of the fundamental questions that serious research asks these days, because it's very difficult. I will just offer my own opinion that a large portion of these objects are not ours. And I think that's what you find when you speak with individuals within the classified world. I've been privileged to do that many, many times, some extremely prominent individuals, if I may say, and that is their opinion as well.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman Cook, please.
Captain Fenstermacher, unlike some of the other testimony here today, you said that you didn't wait too long before you started talking about it. Am I correct in understanding that?
No, I just came forward after I saw Bob Salas.
Oh, excuse me, I misunderstood that then. And I just want to say I would commend all of you for coming out with your statements. And I certainly understand the reasons why for many, many years you may be reluctant. But had you, I thought I'd heard something that I misheard, obviously. But the reason I'm asking this is because I want to ask you all each about the Air Force Project Blue Book. Blue Book was being done, there's a lot of money spent on Project Blue Book by the Air Force during, the 47 to 69 period, and some of your events occurred that you've talked about, certainly, Mr. Salas, your event occurred while Blue Book was still being funded and written about, and Blue Book is, as I understand it, totally published now. It's out. And let me make sure I understand. I think the year of your, what you saw, witnessed,
76.
76. Yes. And again, 74. 66. So both the two captains right directly in front of me here, the things that you saw, is there any indication in Project Blue Book about those, or were you ever contacted in regards? I take it you were never contacted in regards to Project Blue Book at the time, or am I wrong on that?
No,
or by anybody in the Air Force that was telling you that that's what they were doing. They were gathering. I realize they may take your statements, not tell you why they're taking them and so
So the
on.
only thing they did with me is shove a piece of paper in my face and told me to sign it. I never heard another word about it afterwards. In researching, I've been researching this subject for 18, 19 years now. And recently I discovered that Project Blue Book had secret files. They had two sets of files, one available to the public and a set of secret files. And so, again, I've got evidence of this. So, no, when the Conant investigator came to Malmstrom Air Force Base to talk to our deputy base commander, Colonel Chase, this was said this was a classified incident. You could not review the report. So they put it in a classified Blue Book file at the time.
Okay. And do you have any feeling of the same question, on the same question, Captain Schindel?
At the time, I knew nothing about Blue Book per se. I do recall an instance during my time at Minot where there was some discussion amongst some crew members about Blue Book. But I never knew what that was at the time until later, 40 years later, and then I find out about Blue Book, and then I find out about this article in the Saturday Evening Post, and I find out about Val Smith, who's in my squadron, and then I find out about released documents from the Air Force that mention his name. And now I understand that's where the talk about Blue Book came about.
That's very likely that not too many people in the Air Force, even captains and colonels and everything else, even generals, knew that much about Blue Book. Am I right? I mean, I imagine that you've reviewed some of what's in Blue Book since. I mean, recently, for example,
Yes.
Captain Sauce. Is there anything in Blue Book that's been published now that would indicate anything close to what you saw in Montana or in, let's see, it was North Dakota, Minot, or in Wyoming, or in the other? Have you looked at that? Is there any, in other words?
No, sir.
Well, okay. And do you have any of you have any feeling as to why they stopped Blue Book? Or do you have any, can you give us your opinion?
Yes, sir.
Totally opinion of why Blue Book was discontinued.
Yes, Mr. Cook, I alluded to it in my statement. The Condon investigation, which was supposed to look into the UFO question for the Air Force, was a whitewash. It was intended to allow the Air Force to wash its hands of the UFO question. And I have evidence of that. The evidence that I have is the fact that Dr. Craig, who was the chief investigator for Condon, was given information about the Echo and Oscar flight shutdowns. He was given names and dates, et cetera, and never followed up on it. The Condon investigators never followed up on it. Robert Lowe never followed up on it. It was never mentioned, and that's because it was classified.
I would like to just answer your question very quickly. I can give you the quick lowdown on Blue Book. Blue Book was formed in 1952 as a result of a tremendous upsurge in UFO sightings that were happening at that time. That was the only time in Blue Book's history that they actually had a staff that was capable of doing investigations. They had about 12 people. Their percentage of unknowns for that year was quite high. It was almost 25%. The order came down after the CIA-sponsored Robertson panel, which was at the very end of the Truman administration, to say, that's too high. This problem is too big, and we need to knock UFOs out of the public mind. And Blue Book was then gutted and stripped of really all capabilities, and for the rest of its existence, it had no more than a staff of about 4 or 5 people with no capability and were on strict orders. This is an explicit Air Force order of 1954-55 saying you are required to get your number of unknowns down to a bare minimum. And they did that by hook or crook, didn't matter. So it became very much a kind of an open joke, to be quite frank. The Blue Book explanations were generally not considered very valid because they were not sufficiently investigated in any scientific way.
I hope the chair will allow one quick follow-up question that will take 10 seconds to answer, so about that.
Proceed, Congressman.
Okay. is your opinion then, Mr. Dolan, that the Air Force is more reluctant even today than they were during that period of 52 to 67 to even talk about or discuss or take information from captains and sergeants and colonels and even generals, any kind of pilots and so on, than they were then?
Absolutely, I believe that this is a complete nightmare for them to deal with.
Our final presenter before our break, our 10-minute break or so, will be Congresswoman Woolsey.
Well, I was sitting here, thank you, all five of you and Steve, who was there before you, you know, getting really uncomfortable about the position this has put you in all these years, and honoring you in my heart for getting past that and getting here today, and knowing that was not an easy thing to do. But I wanted to then reflect back on why is this panel, why are we all retired members of Congress? Well, you know what? We don't have a lot to lose. But it would be, this would be one of the issues that a sitting member would risk losing an election over. A 60-second, ad.
And clearance.
And clearance, yeah, into, to find out data that you have to have clearance for. And, but then that was the third piece of this is to me, and I feel maybe I'm being too optimistic. I think this week is going to change the feeling and respect that the common constituent, the regular member of our country, the population, the populace, I think if they pay any attention to this, they are going to have a different respect for it. And they'll be able to say it. Instead of whispering to me, people who knew, I get teased a lot because I'm one of the most progressive members that have left the House, but that was in the House. And so my constituents, they're really supportive of me, lucky me. But they would come in and they would whisper, you know, Congresswoman, I think there's something to this. And I would say, well, if it is or isn't, I'm going to go and find out why we can't find out. And they can count on, you know, that I would do that. But I'm not sure I would have done it if I was a sitting member. I have to be honest with you.
Ms. Woolsey, may I make a comment?
Yes.
For the last year, we have been sending documents, myself and Mr. Victor Bigliani of Zealand Communications, have been sending documents to Representative Peter King of New York.
Mm-hmm.
He's got all the documents, he's got my book, he knows my story, but he has not acted on it. I've also briefed Congressman Rohrabacher, congressman from California. Yeah, I think he's still in Congress. And,
yes, he is.
I briefed him, I think it was the year 2000, and he still hasn't acted on this.
Well, there's 433 other members that haven't acted also. So
Yes. I just wanted to point that out.
I hope that this week could make it more comfortable for them and maybe help put the pressure on our government to be more open and to stop covering up and having secret files. So I thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to take a short 8-10 minute stretch or break for a moment, and when we come back, we'll conclude for the afternoon.